Right, good morning, everybody, and welcome to this webinar to discuss the Memorandum of Understanding. For those who are unfamiliar with the term, the Memorandum of Understanding to ban conversion therapy is, in its second version, a policy designed to prevent conversion therapy with trans people, the first having been created to prevent conversion therapy with gay people. It has been signed up to by many public organisations, as well as psychotherapy and counselling regulatory bodies. The morning now will run from 10:30 to 1 o'clock with a coffee break at 11:40 until 12. The first part will focus on presentations from our speakers with very brief Q&A following each presentation, and the second will feature further questions to the panel. If you'd like to ask a question, please put these into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will consider these during the coffee break. We welcome diverse views, but please stick to asking brief questions so that we're able to answer as many as possible. Now, the running order will be James Caspian, Robert Withers, Stella O'Malley, and James Esses. And now just to briefly introduce the speakers. James Caspian is a psychotherapist with an interest in analytical psychology and spirituality. He served as a trustee of the Beaumont Trust and of UKCP, and in this capacity was involved with the creation of the MOU from 2015. He worked for 10 years within a specialist gender clinic with people undergoing gender transition and undertook primary research into the experiences of transgendered people in the People's Republic of China, Taiwan, and Hong Kong, before going on to begin to research the experiences of people reversing their gender transitions. Okay, Robert Withers is a training analyst with the Society of Analytical Psychology, a member of the BPC and the UKCP. He has 35 years' experience as an analytical psychotherapist and Jungian analyst. He's taught on a variety of analytic trainings and is a former senior lecturer at the University of Westminster and the Inter-University College at Graz. In 1990, he founded the Rock Clinic, a community-based psychotherapy and counselling service in Brighton. Since working with a detransitioning client there in the early 90s, he's developed a special interest in transgender issues and has, to date, published 5 academic papers, made several media appearances, and lectured internationally on the subject. Stella O'Malley is a psychotherapist, best-selling author, and public speaker. Stella often writes for the media and has written 3 books on mental health: Cottonwool Kids, Bullyproof Kids, and Fragile. In 2018, Stella was the presenter of the highly acclaimed Channel 4 documentary, Trans Kids, It's Time to Talk. And in 2019, she contributed a chapter to the book, Inventing Transgender Children and Young People. In 2020, Stella founded the Gender Dysphoria Support Network, also known as GDSN, an international support network that holds regular support meetings for families who've been impacted by gender dysphoria. In December 2020, Sasha Ide and Stella launched the podcast Gender, A Wider Lens, in a bid to explore the concept of gender from a psychological depth perspective. Since last June, Stella founded GenSpect, an organisation that aims to give voice to parents of gender-divergent children. James Esses began his career as a criminal defence barrister. He has spent recent years specialising in criminal law and criminal justice through the public sector, including in the role of Head of Policy at the Crown Prosecution Service. James subsequently decided to transition into a career in psychotherapy. Up until events that James will discuss in his talk, he was partway through his master's training and also spent over 5 years as a volunteer counsellor at Childline. James drafted a public petition at the start of 2021 asking the government to safeguard exploratory therapy for children with gender dysphoria. This subsequently received over 10,000 signatures and a favourable government response. Thank you very much. And now over to our first speaker, who is James Caspian.
Thank you, Mel. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming to the webinar to discuss the MOU2. Mel's introduced me. I just want to say a little bit about my work and how it was that I became involved with the MOU, what my concerns have been about it, and a little bit about the research that's coming out and what's been happening. I served as a trustee of the Beaumont Trust for 17 years. The Beaumont Trust was a charity which sought to inform and educate about transgendered people of all kinds, and to that end published pamphlets, books, gave talks, and was involved in policy discussions. I was then a trustee of UKCP for 2 years from 2015, and I arrived on the board of UKCP just at the time when MOU2 was being formulated, and I was asked to advise on that. Earlier than that, in 2004, I'd done some extensive research into the experiences of transgendered people in China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, which involved traveling in those countries and interviewing quite a lot of people who'd transitioned, medically transitioned. And then that was followed by 10 years of working in a specialist gender clinic where I was counseling people who were undergoing medical gender transition or considering it. And so it was on that basis that when I joined the board of UKCP in 2015, that I was asked to advise on the strength of my clinical experience on the MOU. Now, of course, a memorandum of understanding is simply a policy. A policy is effectively a set of rules, and the memorandum has been signed up to by a number of public bodies and organisations. What that then means is that the members of those bodies or those people working for them then have to abide by that set of rules, by that policy. So the Memorandum of Understanding 2, which was brought in for discussion in 2015, followed on from the Memorandum of Understanding number 1. That was to ban conversion therapy with gay people. MOU2 was to include in that definition transgendered people. And so when I first looked at what was being written, and the wording of the MOU as it stands now is not dissimilar to what it was then. There have been some changes. First, speaking to the working group, which was conceiving the wording, and secondly, through the board of UKCP, relaying to the committee what I thought about it. I was really quite concerned because the wording of the MOU seemed to me to be in many ways quite ambiguous and open to interpretation in ways that wouldn't be helpful to patients. And this was because it said that while there might be grounds for exploration with somebody who's uncertain about their gender identity, the implication was that if somebody was certain about it, that there might not be grounds for exploration in that. And then somebody working with a patient could be in danger of being complained about for conversion therapy and feel unable to actually do the work that was needed. And I'll qualify this as I go on, but when I talk about what I discovered in my research, well, I was alarmed by this because in 2014, I'd had a conversation with a surgeon called Dr. Miro Djordjevic, who works in Belgrade in Serbia, and he does gender reassignment surgery from male to female and female to male. People go there from all over the world to have surgery with Dr. Djordjevic. And he told me that by 2014, he'd had 7 patients who'd asked him for what he called reverse gender reassignment surgery, which actually you can't really reverse gender reassignment surgery. All you can do is do cosmetic surgery to try to recreate the genitalia that's been removed. And he said that this had never happened before, and he was worried, and there was no research into it. So I decided to research it. And I did preliminary research for 2 years into people who were reversing surgery. But I also discovered that there were growing numbers of people that were reversing gender transition without necessarily even having surgery, or if they had, reversing it. They were either living with that, or if they were taking hormones, they were stopping hormones. And they clearly wanted to be part of my research. So I started to look into that as well. I was also aware in my own work that there'd been a big change in the demographic of people coming forward to clinics looking for treatment.
Sure.
They've become younger, and about 3 times as many females as males, natal females, were coming forward. In the past, the average person going to a gender clinic would be a natal male in early middle age. And that changed hugely in the years after 2010 and has continued to. A lot of the young people that I was speaking to and hearing from in this preliminary phase of research were saying that they felt that they had very complex mental health difficulties. Many of them had suffered trauma and abuse, and they felt that they hadn't been adequately assessed. They hadn't been asked to really look into their past and their histories and what had been going on with them. And they felt also that in many ways they'd become part of a movement. They'd been very exciting and uplifting, and they felt that this was going to solve all their problems. And then they found that it didn't. And for some of them, then that meant detransition. So now there is some beginning of research into this. There still hasn't been extensive research. Most research into detransition and long-term outcomes, there's very little research into long-term outcomes of gender transition, is quite old, and it predates the demographic changes that we've seen in this area, and it predates the huge rise in numbers of people going to gender clinics. So in September this year, there's been a piece of research published by Lisa Littman, and this was research with 100 detransitioners, and 55% of that group felt that they did not receive adequate evaluation by doctors or mental health professionals, and 24% didn't tell their clinicians that they had detransitioned. So this highlights for me the danger that the MOU can be used to prevent adequate assessment, but not just assessment. You know, it's a very sort of technical term, isn't it? We're talking about people's whole lives. We're talking about working with people often in distress, who many of whom do have very complex histories and histories of trauma and mental health problems. And yet, at the same time, MOU2 is being perceived as a means to ensure that there is an affirmation-only approach to treating gender dysphoria, to working with this group of patients. And the affirmation-only approach is, and this comes from the people who I spoke to and who contacted me, that they said that when they went to the clinic and said, this is my gender identity, I'm trans, or whatever their identity was, there are many different identities, that they were accepted. Yes, great, you are. So let's get you onto treatment. And they felt that this wasn't adequate. And in fact, the BACP journal in 2018 published a letter saying that the MOU was suggesting that affirmation is non-negotiable with this patient group. So when I was giving transgender awareness trainings to the public sector and the private sector, I would often be approached after the training by people who'd attended. And this would be, if it was in a general hospital, it could be social workers or nurses or people who are working on the front line with patients, who said that they were concerned about these kind of issues, but they felt that they couldn't voice their concerns. There was an atmosphere of fear around the whole subject. But people felt they couldn't say what they thought. They couldn't discuss the nuances and the complexities of this whole field. My advice to include in MOU2 the fact that people do detransition from gender transition, and that the area is very complex and we need to look at research. This was ignored, and policy should be made using a robust evidence base and not simply by asking a group of people what they think. So I'm going to leave it there, and thank you very much for listening, and I'd be happy if there are any questions.
Thank you very much, James. We have one question. Do we know if UKCB consider psychotherapists holding or expressing gender-critical beliefs to be unethical and therefore subject to official complaint?
The answer to that is no, we don't know.
We don't know. Okay.
No, UKCP haven't communicated about that.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, over to our next speaker, who is Bob Withers.
Hello, thanks. I'm really pleased that we've got people here from both sides of this really contentious and difficult debate. I'm going to try not to respond to the ad hominem attacks that seem to be going on in the Q&A, because I think that's a bit of a waste of time. We're here discussing some serious issues, not personalities. And I hope we can all agree that these figures that James Caspian just talked about to do with detransition. These are things which should concern everybody. We should be trying to protect people from unnecessary medical treatment that they come to regret. And I hope all of us here can agree that that's a worthy thing to do, and we need to think about how we can do it best. Can I just correct one thing that James said, which is the Lisa Lippman paper? He said that only 24% of the people who detransitioned went back and reported that to their clinicians. And I read the paper last night, and my recollection is that it was only 24% who did go back and report that they had detransitioned. So actually 3/4 of people didn't. And that means that there's a lot more people out there who are not happy with their transition than are being picked up in the official figures at the moment. So that's one thing. Let's try and think about how we can protect these people from being harmed by medical treatment that they will come to regard as a mistake or as something that they didn't need. Over half of the people in the Lippman paper wished that if they'd said that if they knew then, what they know now, they would not have gone through to transition. Not everybody that did transition said they regretted it, but the majority said that they wouldn't have done it if they knew what they know now. So I think we need to think about what it is that leads these people to make this mistake. And although this wasn't a question in the Lippman paper, 23% of people spontaneously said that retrospectively they came to realize that they were battling with internalized homophobia. That is that they didn't realize that they were being homophobic at the time, but what was happening was that society, culture, their peers, and sometimes their clinicians were offering them a way of reframing their nascent homosexuality as in fact being trapped in the wrong body. So what were really ego-alien feelings of sexual feelings in their bodies were being reinterpreted through this cultural narrative as actually being trapped in the wrong body because the feelings in the body felt wrong to that person. And that's the danger of the affirmative approach, is that it encourages this misidentification of homosexuality with being trapped in the wrong body. The other things that they looked at retrospectively were trauma. So a lot of them had suffered trauma, including sexual trauma, sometimes at an age when they couldn't really make sense of what was going on. And again, the body was experiencing things which, if you're a young woman and you're being sexually abused, you may feel that your femininity, your body has kind of let you down and led you into an experience which you wish you hadn't had. And for some of these people, the male identification is a way of protecting against that vulnerability. Again, it's really difficult to generalize about trans because so many people are so different. There isn't one narrative that covers everybody and everything. And I'm not trying to suggest that everybody's trans identification comes from these sorts of traumatic or ego-alien sexual feelings or other traumas. But if you read the Lippman paper, you can see that a significant number of people identify these as factors which contributed to them making this decision, which they wish they hadn't taken. You'll see that a lot of these factors at the time the decision's made, that they're unconscious. The person with the internalized homophobia doesn't know that what they're struggling with. They just interpret the body feeling as being in the wrong body and being trans. It's only later on that they come to realize what's happened. And so from my perspective as an analytical psychologist, this means that they were carrying a knowledge that they were not conscious of. There was an unconscious knowledge of something going on. And this for me is crucial, to try where it is, where it's present, to try and help a person contact the unconscious knowledge that they're carrying, which may give them a different way of working with their gender dysphoria. I think it's important to distinguish between this word gender dysphoria and being trans, because gender dysphoria is really the suffering which comes from having a gender identity which differs from the biological sex of the body. But you may have a gender identity which is different from your biological sex, but you might not suffer from that. So the question is, if you're suffering from gender dysphoria, what is the best way of dealing with that suffering? And unfortunately, at the moment, there's a kind of cultural narrative which promotes the idea that medical treatment is the best or indeed the only way of dealing with that. Actually, the evidence base for that is very, very poor. It's rated poor by NICE. It's rated either poor or very poor because there are no controlled trials. It's just anecdotal. People say that they have been helped, and some people do say they've been helped, but other people, a growing number of people, are saying actually they haven't been helped. They've misidentified what was going on. And I think as therapists, we need to be able to be open to exploring other possibilities without being disrespectful to somebody's trans identity, because if somebody identifies as the opposite gender to their biological sex, for them this may be a crucial part of who they are. And I think personally, as therapists, I think we should affirm this person's trans identity, but without closing down the exploration. And I also think that if we can find a way of helping this person manage their gender dysphoria without making permanent changes to their body that they come to regret, that is a better outcome than encouraging them and affirming them along a path to affirmative medical treatment. And as a member of the UKCP and the BPC who have signed up to this Memorandum of Understanding, I'm worried that that belief could lay me open to the claim that I'm practicing conversion therapy. Why? Because it may be that I'm implicitly preferring one gender identity over another. It may be because if somebody reconciles themselves to their body and in the process changes a gender identity, then I could be seen to be promoting gender identity change. And this is not protected in the Memorandum of Understanding. If I decided as a therapist to promote medical treatment, that is protected. I'm allowed to do that under the memorandum. If you look at the small print, that's protected. But this needs ironing out. We need to go back and be able to talk to the people who are devising the Memorandum of Understanding and saying, look, do you realize there are these unintended consequences? We might be converting gay people into being trans. We might be promoting people with mental health problems into taking a path that they could later regret. We need to be able to find ways of protecting explorative therapy that opens those possibilities up without disrespecting the trans person and without putting the therapist at risk of being accused of practicing something which I have heard called covert conversion therapy. I was at the UKCP webinar the other day where various scenarios were described as covert conversion therapy, and it's far from clear what those are. So what we're arguing as a group is that we need to be very careful to protect therapists who want to try and help prevent this harm which has been done to the people who later decide they want to detransition, and as James rightly said, feel that they were not given enough exploratory therapy, enough protection, enough challenge. Kira Bell case, just finally to say that her appeal was granted in favour of the Tavistock, and that very clearly put the obligation back on the therapy community out of the law. And that means that we have a far greater obligation than we had to get this right. We don't want putting something in place which will inhibit therapists from exploring alternatives to medical treatment because they're afraid that they're going to be struck off or complained against for practicing conversion therapy. Just finally one point, the other guidelines that we've been following at the WPATH, the World Association of Professional Transgender Health, if you read that through, not only does it implicitly encourage working affirmatively with children and young people, which is, really debatable whether they have the capacity to understand at an early age what the consequences of losing fertility and losing sexual function is. Not only does it not protect those children and young people, it doesn't have any mention whatsoever of the unconscious. Now, I realize not all therapists believe in the unconscious. Some people just believe in unconditional positive regard and going with the client. But if you're taking a more analytic view, then it becomes important to bear in mind the possibility that some of these trans identifications, not all of them, but some of them may be arising from these sorts of unconscious factors. And I think we need, as a profession, to protect ourselves from being accused of practicing conversion therapy. And the danger with the memorandum as it stands at the moment is it could serve as a rod to beat our own backs. And actually, this non-separation of gay conversion therapy from trans conversion therapy or gender identity conversion therapy is, in my opinion, very unhelpful. It confuses everything, and it makes it very, very difficult to protect both the young people who are making life-changing decisions and also the therapists. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Bob. We have one question. The WPATH Standards of Care says, often with the help of psychotherapy, some individuals integrate their trans or cross-gender feelings into the gender role they were assigned at birth and do not feel the need to feminize or masculinize their body. How is the MOU2 compatible with that?
Compatible or incompatible? Yeah, I mean, that I'm not sure what the question's asking. How is it compatible with that? I think the MOU and that aspect of the WPATH guidelines, they are compatible with each other. The problem is that although there are some people who explore their gender dysphoria psychotherapeutically and decide not to medicalize themselves, there are quite a lot of people who don't. And what I'm saying about the WPATH guidelines is, in particular, they don't give any recognition to the importance of the unconscious. And if you read, there's not just a paper by Lisa Lippman, there's another paper by Alexander Lemmer come out recently, where she makes it quite clear that with a number of case studies, that the unconscious factors can, in certain cases, be very important in terms of determining trans identity. We should hopefully we'll give a list of references at the end of the webinar, so that if anybody wants to pick up on these, they can look at it further. But the point I was making here is that the WPATH guidelines don't actually include any recognition of the possibility that somebody, for instance, might be unconscious of their homophobia at the time they make their decision to transition, only later coming to realize that they were repressing their homosexual orientation from consciousness. Those are things which need to be put in to safeguard these young people, so we don't just repeat the mistakes of unnecessary transition that are going on at the moment.
Okay, thank you. The questioner has added an additional point, saying the point is the SOC says psychotherapy works. Further question for you, Bob, if I may.
Yeah.
What if a client changes their mind after seeing a therapist, then having medical transition? Can they sue their therapist for conversion therapy? Is that clear?
No, let me get my head around it. If they change their mind having transitioned, if a patient has been affirmed by their therapist into transitioning and then regrets it, what the Kira Bell appeal does is it puts that back in the hands of the patient to complain about the affirmative therapist, and the patient is being encouraged by the appeal judgment to sue the therapist, to make a complaint and sue the therapist. So yes, you can sue your therapist for recommending and encouraging you to have a treatment that has harmed you.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, now moving on to Stella O'Malley, if we may.
Hi there, how's it going? Thank you very much to Bob and James so far. It's been very interesting. I suppose what I would like to talk about just to start off is really what we as therapists, what our role is as therapists when a client comes in front of us. And I think it's very important that we remember that when I don't care whether the person in front of me has maybe gender issues or maybe sexual issues or maybe eating issues. I don't think it should be differentiated insofar as what we're trying to see is the whole person. What we're trying to see is there's a person in front of me who has decided to come for therapy, and that we should be able to work as ethical therapists and provide the therapy that we believe that this person needs. And my big fear for the MOU2, and it's kind of obviously happening, is that lots of therapists feel constricted. Lots of therapists feel that they can't explore other issues. And some therapists are going ahead and saying, well, as an ethical therapist, I need to explore issues. As Bob Withers said, some therapists work very much on the basis of the unconscious, and that's their job, that's their training, that's what they've been kind of training for 35 years to do, which is exactly what they should be doing. So if you want to provide a proper therapeutic process to somebody, you should kind of bring in your entire training, your experience, the ethics of your accreditation body, and then you see the whole person in front of you. The very fact that we've had the need to put forward this conference to discuss it, to bring kind of total therapists together and say, can we discuss this? It seems to be silencing therapists. And anything that's silencing or restricting therapists has an issue. And so what we need to do is discuss it. And that's the concept of us being here today. And I would hope that anybody who massively disagrees with me just thinks, okay, if I disagree with you and you disagree with me, well, let's try and talk our way into a place like therapists should, is I listen, you talk, I listen. And that's the kind of back and forth that all professionals should do. May I say, especially therapists should do, that we should be able to handle disagreement. Handling conflict is our job. And so I suppose my big fear about the MOU2 is the feeling of being silenced. I have no doubt James Esses will talk more about that and how that is impacting the integrity of our profession. And I think we really need to be very, very careful if you're trying to silence other therapists, because we all know, if anybody knows our history, you'd know when you silence groups of people, it goes underground, it goes toxic, it goes difficult, and people start to come out in a reactionary way. And I'm hoping that it won't be reactionary. I'm hoping that actually maybe we could become like kind of a progressive society that discusses our issues. I know that for myself, when I look at different kind of studies that have been on recently, like Lisa Lippman's 2018 paper and our paper released last week, there are issues that aren't being properly addressed. And I suppose that's what's deeply concerning me. One would be the concept of ROGD, the rapid onset gender dysphoria. And people say it doesn't exist. And I'm like, I don't care whether you think it exists or not, so long as we're allowed to talk about it and discuss it and talk about why are people talking about a concept such as ROGD if it doesn't exist. That in and of itself means that it needs more discussion. I do know that a lot of the people I've met over the course of the last few years have definitely identified with the concept, the phenomenon, the description of ROGD. And that is, these are vulnerable kids who never showed any sign of gender nonconformity, or not never, but very often didn't show gender nonconformity. And then they either had a trauma, they might have had many other diagnoses. I know 63%, 62.5% of the kids in, let's say, Lisa Lippman's study, they already had other diagnoses. So when the diagnosis of gender dysphoria came for these children, it was on the back of other diagnoses. So there was many things to kind of confront as a therapist. Now, I would argue no ethical therapist will just zero in on one diagnosis and disregard other diagnoses. If you're doing that, I would say you're not serving the client properly. And our job is to look at the whole picture and to make sure nothing is being lost. And so if 62.5% of these kids have other diagnoses, and that is being dismissed because gender on some level is a special condition, well, I'd say we're missing big parts of that child. We're missing big parts of the therapeutic process. And so we need to be cognizant that that isn't very ethical and it isn't very, it's not sufficient. And that phrase, it's necessary but not sufficient, kind of rings loudly when I'm considering the Memorandum of Understanding and affirmative approach and what we should do with the child when they come in with any sort of gender-related distress. Because I would certainly affirm the client, I would certainly affirm the depth of their emotion, I would affirm that they believe what they believe and they truly and deeply believe it. I would affirm the thoughts they have. I would affirm that they are deeply distressed in various different ways. But I don't confirm it. It's not my job to kind of give them some sort of branding of, yes, you have gender-related distress and therefore you should transition. That's not my job. That, I would argue, is going too far. It's taking autonomy away from the client, and it's in a way almost acting godlike. And so that's why I'm very concerned that the affirmative approach has been kind of taken as a concept, and it's a new concept. We're only about 10 years into it. It's got no long-term quality base of evidence to show us that it's either good, bad, or indifferent. We don't know because we don't have the long-term evidence. And I think it's very important that we don't confirm and we don't put ourselves in a position where we are some sort of authority that can see into the soul of the client in front of us and we can designate them that they should medically transition. I know a friend of mine, Patrick, he wrote some, he produced some amazing YouTube videos. He's really from France, but he lives in Germany. And he went into his psychologist and he was in deep distress. He had had a lot of trauma. And just like it's, saying in the detrans paper of 100 detransitioners, and I know both James and Bob discussed this, so I won't go into it further. But he was like those people who said, I had lots of unexplored distress when I walked into the office. And the psychologist in front of Patrick, within 40 minutes, told Patrick that yes, he was transgender and yes, he should medically transition. And Patrick thought this is a highly qualified professional in the field who sees that I should transition. And Patrick went ahead and had a medical transition. Some months later, Patrick was at a conference and he saw his psychologist speaking. And the psychologist said, as part of his talk, I affirm everybody who comes in, I affirm all of them that they should medically transition because that's my job, And Patrick had this awful moment of, oh, so he didn't see me as an individual. He affirms everybody. And from then, Patrick went ahead and he actually detransitioned. But that horrific moment in that conference when he realized that his psychologist didn't see him as an individual, didn't see the whole person, didn't even try to penetrate any sort of deeper picture, underlying motivations, maybe internalized homophobia, maybe other diagnoses that were driving somebody one way when they should be going another way, or they certainly should have the exploratory space to go many different ways. He presumed, Patrick bestowed all sorts of kind of authority on the professional, and the professional presumed to bestow back on him the decision that he should medically transition. And that is a really inappropriate authority to be given therapists, and an inappropriate situation where the Memorandum of Understanding 2 is saying that this is how we should be as therapists. And this is where it's getting very, I suppose, uncomfortable for a lot of people. Because some people are saying, and I can see it in the chat, some people are saying, let's say, we should be exploratory and affirmative. And I'm like, yeah, certainly we should. We should also be able to discuss what does exploratory and affirmative mean. We should also be kind of unafraid to sit here like I am and not feel nervous that somebody's going to try and cynically misinterpret my words. Because I'm trying to say, what does it mean? How should we go forward? Are we making sure that we've got the best wording possible so the therapist can work in the most efficient and effective and ethical way possible? I certainly shouldn't be so nervous. I certainly shouldn't be kind of wary that my words will be misinterpreted, because that's not what our profession is about. All of us came in on some level to kind of help people. That was the concept. It's just we disagree on how we should help people. And I think we should maybe discuss the fact that we disagree on how we should help people. I do want to point out that I work for the IATDD, which is the International Association for Desisters and Detransitioners. And when I work with detransitioners, they're angry and they're bitter about the therapy they've received. These are very, very distressed people who thought that they should medically transition, carried out medical transition, maybe mastectomies, maybe hysterectomies, certainly quite significant medical transition, and then came to an understanding that the gender identity that they thought was within them actually wasn't within them. It was something else. It was deep distress, and they called it gender identity, and it turned out to be other issues that they should address. And now I'm working with detransitioners, and they're addressing finally the issues that they should have been addressing way back in the day. When they were going to medically transition, these people were frankly one and all affirmed, and they're very, very unhappy with the affirmative process. And so what should we do about that? Should we dismiss them? Should we blame them? Or should we actually say, well, hang on, maybe we've run too far with this ball, and maybe we should start readdressing what does affirmative mean? How far do we go with affirmative? Is it exploratory part of affirmative, or is it not? And I saw some of the questions were actually saying, oh, it is, and oh, it isn't, and is it gender critical beliefs protected within it? And nobody has a notion. Nobody seems to know any of these answers because it's unclear, because it's a badly worded document. And when something's a badly worded document, it should just get reappraised and then worded better, because that's how a progressive society works. I do want to say a little bit else, little bit more. I'm sure I'm ranting, and I look forward to any questions that are coming up. But I want to say that there's been a kind of a slide from the therapeutic process into therapeutic support. And so When you work in therapy, I would believe that as an ethical therapist, my job is to provide a therapeutic process. And the process is a large process where I kind of explore the person and explore everything that kind of comes into the room. And whether that is an unconscious motivation or whether that is maybe internalized deep inner conflict that they're not addressing, it's my job. Certainly, I'm quite person centered in my approach, so I certainly don't start challenging anybody from the outset. But I don't think it's appropriate to just give therapeutic support, because therapeutic support has its own kind of place. You know what I mean? You could argue that maybe the Samaritans and maybe other kind of organizations like that are giving therapeutic support. Therapeutic process is what the therapist is giving. There is a difference. And we need to have the kind of freedom to be able to give a process so that the person comes, realizes we've addressed everything. The therapist hasn't just nodded along and just allowed me to kind of say anything and just kind of said, yeah. Because that I don't think is giving enough weight. And I wouldn't be right if I didn't finish with just a point about the parents, because obviously I work for GenSpect, and GenSpect is representing, over 14 different countries and over 16 different organizations from these different countries. And all the parents are all from different parent groups all over the world. They number in their thousands, and they're all saying the same thing. They're saying, my child is vulnerable, and the treatment my child is receiving for their gender-related distress doesn't seem to be appropriate or sufficient. They need better quality treatment. They need a deeper understanding. They need more empathy. And we need to listen to a situation where thousands of parents are saying, my vulnerable kid isn't getting the right support. If that's the case, then we need to listen to them. They might be wrong, they might be right. We certainly need to listen to them. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Stella. We have a couple of questions and a comment. Firstly, does the affirmation approach not show preferation of one gender identity over another? Can this be said to be a truly neutral approach?
Yeah, that's a great question by Stephanie Davis-Arai. Great to see you here. Yeah, what a really good point. I think the affirmation approach does show preference over one gender identity over the other. And what do we do with that? Because you could say it's a form of conversion therapy because it's actually focusing on one gender identity over another. And it's, in a way, converting somebody to one identity. The actual word medical transition is a form of conversion, if you follow me, because you're transitioning. You're moving from one to the other. And when you look at the word, what does the word conversion means? It's some sort of changeover. It gets really, really messy, and I know I'm probably madly in the weeds with that, but it gets really messy, why it needs a very well-worded document. It needs serious clarity. Sexual orientation needs to be discussed, and gender identity needs to be discussed. And lumping them both together shows a lack of nuance that would worry me.
Okay, thank you. And why are so many gay people advocating for transient children?
Why are so many gay people advocating for what?
Well, it looks like transient children.
Transient.
Maybe transitioning children. It could be a typo.
I would like to answer that, even if it hasn't been answered. That's the one I'd like to, because I ask myself, why are so many gay people advocating for medical transition of young people who are, frankly, quite a lot of them are quite likely to be gay if they're given the opportunity to go through biological puberty and to kind of feel their sexual awakening that hopefully doesn't get blocked by puberty blockers. I believe it's because people who haven't thought enough about this situation presume that being gay is the same as being transgender. And that's a massive leap that doesn't hold water. I see this is a huge assumption that I've just made. What's the huge assumption I wonder that I've made? Would it be that an awful lot of gay people are very... Oh, yeah, an awful lot of gay people. Yeah, I'll stand by my huge assumption. An awful lot of gay people, yes, certainly, do seem to support medical transition of young people. And they seem to do it because they think trans is the new gay. And I think they're incorrect. I think there's a very big difference between your gender identity and your sexual orientation. And I think it just feels progressive. And so they presume that a young trans gender identifying child is the very same as a young pre-gay child. And I think it needs an awful lot more thought. We don't really know how it comes out that you are gay. We don't really know how that kind of develops over time. And we need to give everybody the opportunity to go through a sexual awakening between the ages of 10 and 25 and come to some sort of kind of, I don't know, reckoning with themselves and their sexuality. To cut it off at 10, to stop it at 11, to bring in puberty blockers at that time, it feels incredibly short, kind of focused.
Okay, thank you. And then there's a plea for some specialist training for people working with gender and sexual diversity. This is from a student. I'm a student in counselling, so I'm in early days of training and experience, so apologise for my ignorance. What I'm unclear about is how the affirmation approach works under a humanistic approach, person-centred counselling. Can a humanistic counsellor actively affirm anything? Is this what Stella said, just confirmation instead, and that is simply not our job? What modality of counselling would actively confirm a client towards medical transition?
Yeah, well, I agree with this student counsellor that would be the questions I want answered. And I feel that we haven't got it answered so far with the information we've been given. But yeah, that's exactly what I feel is happening. And presumptions are being made.
Okay, thank you. And finally, before we move on to James, and I will bring some of these questions up after the break if we haven't covered them. This is from a detransitioner. I'm a detransitioner from the States, and I'm wondering how patient-therapist communication could be better facilitated for the therapist to receive criticism from detransitioners. Many of us who've come up against therapists who in fact encourage us to retransition or dismiss our comorbidities. Comment, thank you for having this panel. It's incredibly encouraging. Okay.
Yeah, the best professionals in any field learn from their mistakes. That's the kind of brave and decent and ethical thing to do in any field. And when you look at detransition and you meet a detransitioner who says, I didn't receive good enough therapy, I didn't really know myself, I feel I wasn't supported. If many of them are saying it, and they are, then we need as a body to realise, actually, maybe we're not providing sufficient therapeutic process. And so I couldn't agree more with that detransitioner. I think there should be a place for detransitioners to be able to go to say, these are the mistakes that I believe were made. And so if each detransitioner can say that in their own therapeutic process, then we'll start getting patterns. Are they all going to be right? No. But certainly will we get patterns and trends of issues we therapists need to address? Definitely.
Okay, thank you very much, Stella. Okay, James Esses, now over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Morning, everyone. The topics of sex, gender, and gender dysphoria are understandably very sensitive and produce heightened emotions on all sides. However, that does not excuse the shutting down of important conversations that need to be held on what is an extremely complex topic, particularly amongst those within the therapeutic community, in which ethical, evidence-based treatment should be at the heart of what we do. Furthermore, it does not excuse the attacks that have and continue to take place against individuals, including clinicians, who seek simply to open a dialogue and challenge the status quo regarding best practice and treatment of gender dysphoria. Now, we have all, I'm sure, witnessed this, or possibly even been on the receiving end of it. Slurs being thrown about needlessly, bigot, transphobe, personal attacks, character assassinations, targeting of reputation and livelihood, and ultimately the conversation being shut down. Now, we have witnessed attacks on some well-known public figures in this space: David Bell, Richard Dawkins, J.K. Rowling. However, in some ways even more concerning is the fact that we are beginning to see the same happen in relation to normal, everyday clinicians, simply trying to do the best for the clients that they serve. In fact, what we're beginning to see amongst professionals who disagree with us is a complete lack of legitimacy and transparency. Now, we've already heard today some of the long-standing and well-founded concerns with the MOU. And my presentation will explore some of the ways in which clinicians, such as myself, and thoughtful therapists as a collective have been shut down in trying to have these concerns heard. Now, when Thoughtful Therapists was founded a mere number of months ago, its aims included seeking an open, constructive, respectful dialogue regarding both the MOU and the government's proposed legislation on conversion therapy that we knew was on the horizon. Where else to begin, we thought, than with contacting the Coalition Against Conversion Therapy, the organisation that oversees and controls the MOU. We had a plan. This felt positive. Within a few hours, we hit a roadblock, one that would unfortunately pave the way for things going forward. We couldn't find them. In fact, we couldn't find anything. No website, no email addresses, no phone number, no minutes of meetings, no policies, nothing. All we could find was what was contained within the MOU itself, namely the content and the list of signatories. Now, already there were red flags, because here was an organisation responsible for a document that governs how almost every registered therapeutic practitioner in this country needs to practice in relation to this topic. And yes, they appeared, at least to us, to be an utter enigma. And so the logical next step, we thought, was to reach out individually to the signatories to find out exactly who holds the pen and governs the document. Generally, although these individuals and organisations have very literally signed this document, we were met with bewilderment, confusion, and inconsistency. Some organisations claimed that the MOU was governed by a central coalition. Others said it was governed by each organisation individually. Some thought UKCP governed it. Others thought it was the BPS. Some even thought Stonewall run it, and Stonewall are not even an official signatory to the document. When asked about opportunities to feed back concerns on the MOU or to input into future coalition meetings, we were met with a brick wall. In fact, when we reached out to one particular signatory called Gendered Intelligence, they were quite blunt and told us that there was no need for feedback because the issue, as far as they were concerned, was, and I quote, resolved. When asked if they were open to hearing differing views, the individual we were speaking to responded and said, and I quote, that they felt worried and uncomfortable by the conversation, and they promptly drew it to a close. It began to feel as if we had truly fallen through the looking glass. Now, eventually, we were given by one of the signatories the name Dr. Iggy Moon, the chair of the coalition, along with an email address. And we were also told that there was an upcoming coalition meeting in a few weeks' time. Now, at last, it felt that we were beginning to make real progress. Now, while all of this had been going on, a number of practitioners within Thoughtful Therapists had been developing a short, evidence-based, referenced set of submissions setting out some of the fundamental concerns with the MOU. And so Thoughtful Therapists emailed Dr. Iggy Moon, copying in all of the signatories to the MOU, introducing ourselves, attaching our proposals, and asking for an opportunity to meet and discuss. We waited, feeling hopeful. Within 24 hours, we received a response directly from Dr. Moon. Needless to say, we did not get the response that we were expecting. Without so much as acknowledging, let alone responding, to any of the substantive points raised, Dr. Moon informed Thoughtful Therapists that they did not want us contacting them and that our email address was to be blocked, before going on and instructing the individual signatories not to respond to us either. In a separate email, Dr. Moon stated that many people who challenged the status quo on this topic were, and I quote, ignorant and opinionated. We could not believe it. Here we were, a group of concerned practitioners and we were effectively being stonewalled by the head of a coalition of signatories regarding a highly important therapeutic document. We subsequently went out to each individual signatory and asked them to meet with us directly, regardless of Dr. Moon's instructions. Every single one of them either failed to respond to us or refused to meet with us. This is part of the reason that we are hosting this webinar here today, because we need to get the message out to members of the therapeutic community of the complete and utter lack of transparency from the powers that be. And unless members start to speak out individually and let their governing bodies know the strongly held concerns that they have, including those that have already been spoken about today, things may never change. So I must now move on to my own personal piece in all of this, and some of you may be aware that I'm currently involved in legal action that I've publicly been crowdfunding for, and so I'm limited in what I can share. But if I take us back a few months to the start of 2021, and at this stage, I was in my third year of a master's degree in integrative psychotherapy at the Metanoia Institute. As a trainee therapist who had been counselling children at Childline for over 5 years, I found myself more and more concerned regarding treatment pathways for those with gender dysphoria. I became more and more worried that affirmation was being encouraged to the exclusion of open exploratory therapy. And so I immersed myself in research. I engaged with those in the trans community. I developed suggestions and feedback. As a concerned member of the community, I wished to reach out to those in power to try and open a dialogue and hopefully make a positive difference. I had written an article which was subsequently published on the online platform Quillette, and it provided a commentary on the social, ethical, political, and therapeutic landscape when it comes to treating children with gender dysphoria, along with potential concerns about legislation in this space and the MOU itself. Given that I was a paid-up trainee member of UKCP, I thought that they would be a good place to start, and so I wrote to them, attaching my article and explaining that I had some concerns around policy in this area, and I would appreciate an opportunity for a conversation to further discuss. I heard nothing for 3 weeks. But then one day an email arrived from the registrar of UKCP. Now, my initial reaction was one of pleasant surprise, because I thought, well, if they're getting the registrar involved, they must be taking my concerns quite seriously. In fact, the letter simply reaffirmed the requirements for me to comply with the MOU in order to become accredited, before going on to say that they would be forwarding my private correspondence with them to Metanoia. The response did not address a single one of the substantive points or concerns I'd raised in my original correspondence. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. My governing body that I'd paid money to join, and which was meant to represent my interests, was treating me with nothing but disdain. I escalated my concerns to the CEO of UKCP and asked for a meeting to discuss. I was told they didn't have the time to speak to me. It was off the back of this that I decided that I needed to find like-minded therapists for support, for discussion, for reflection, and this is how I first became involved in Thoughtful Therapists. Things were fast-moving, and I suggested, in light of our concerns with the MOU and the announced legislation on conversion therapy, that we should launch a public petition to the government asking them to safeguard explorative therapy for children with gender dysphoria. The petition took off. We got over 10,000 signatures in a matter of weeks, and subsequently what was a very positive response from the government. And as a group, we engaged in a lot of publicity around this time, including through the media and also through social media. Fast forward to May of this year, and one day I received an email from Metanoia Institute expelling me from my course summarily on the basis that I had brought them and the profession into disrepute for my petition and associated publicity around the MOU. No evidence was provided, no procedure was followed, no opportunity to put forward my side of the story, no appeal. The same evening, they publicised the expulsion on Twitter. In one single email, My entire life plan was thrown under the bus, and I'm still reeling from what happened. And I'm now taking legal action against them on the basis of discrimination regarding my beliefs on sex and gender. And I've managed to crowdfund almost £70,000 thanks to the huge support of concerned professionals, teachers, parents. Now, as you can understand, I cannot say much more about these proceedings, although I am now also taking a claim against UKCP for information that came to light following a subject access request for my personal data. Now, surely we are living in very worrying times when groups of concerned clinicians can be stonewalled and a trainee therapist such as myself effectively expelled from the profession simply for raising our concerns about policies and the best treatment for vulnerable children with a complex mental health condition. Free, open debate and dialogue on this topic is being shut down, unfortunately, every step of the way. Following the Queen's speech in May, in which the proposed conversion therapy legislation was announced, along with the promise of a thorough consultation, groups including Stonewall called for no consultation whatsoever to take place. Dr. Iggy Moon, on behalf of the Coalition Against Conversion Therapy, recently gave evidence before the Scottish Parliament on conversion therapy, and they told parliamentarians that there should be a limit on research in this field and consultations, and that they should simply push forward with legislating in this space. Now, surely history has taught us that we should be wary of attempts to push things forward, particularly binding legislation, while seeking to avoid proper debate, scrutiny, research, and dialogue. Time and time again, including, unfortunately, amongst fellow professionals, the conversation is being shut down, and I and my colleagues are being attacked with vitriol for daring to ask, should things be done differently? Because if we as clinicians cannot engage in open and respectful dialogue on this issue, it will be to the detriment of our clients and the profession as a whole. More and more colleagues tell me they simply won't work with these clients through fear of being accused of carrying out conversion therapy or demonized by their governing bodies. Conversion therapy, forcing someone to change who they are, should of course be eradicated, but beneficial, explorative therapy must be safeguarded. The stakes are too high. In the words of the Hippocratic Oath, first we must do no harm. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. Thank you. One question that's related to this. What, in your opinion, does the coalition have to hide?
Well, from my own experience of this, that they simply do not want a conversation. I mean, you recall from earlier on in my talk that when we first reached out to some of the signatories, as far as they're concerned, the conversation is already closed. Nothing more needs to be said about this. My guess would be that their fear is that if they were to engage in these discussions and have to confront a lot of the research studies that have been done in this area, they would realise that actually they've gotten it quite badly wrong, and they don't want to acknowledge that. So I think it's easiest for them to actually shut down the conversation before it even begins.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. If anyone has further questions for James, please put them in the Q&A box now, because some of these are for the whole panel, which we will address after the coffee break.
Could I just come in for a second, Mel? And if questions come in for James Esses, maybe they come in after this. I just want to clear up something, because somebody seemed to kind of misinterpret something I said, and I want to be crystal clear. Somebody seemed to think in the chat that I said all kids who are trans were gay, and I don't think that. And I obviously wouldn't think that, because I myself had gender-related distress for at least 7 years, if not longer. And I was consistent and persistent and insistent in my desire and wish to be a boy. And I'm not gay. I'm heterosexual. So I'm not sure why that person misunderstood what I said. I certainly do think internalized homophobia is a major feature for gender non-conforming children, but it's not for all of them, and it certainly wasn't for me. And so I wouldn't have said it. And I did point out during my talk that I was nervous of cynical misrepresentation. And I feel that that was a very good example of cynical misrepresentation, when I was quite clear what I was saying, which was basically, let's look at the whole person and not just one point. Anyway, back to James's questions. I'm sure there's a few questions there.
Yes, surely medical transition should be a last resort after in-depth exploration of unconscious motivations. What's your thoughts about that?
Well, I start where I finished, which was with the Hippocratic Oath. We're all working in the wider field of medicine here. Obviously, we ourselves are specialising in mental health, but we must be sure that we're not doing any harm. And studies time and time again show, particularly for children, that the vast majority of them who feel that they're in the wrong body will eventually, with time, settle into their biological sex. Now, if we contrast that with the figures which show that the vast majority of children who commence on puberty blockers will go on to take cross-sex hormones, how can these two things add up? If we know that over time most children will settle into themselves, possibly also through the provision of explorative therapy, then we must be very wary of starting children down this path, which many would feel is quite a slippery slope, actually, to further medical and surgical interventions. It's not saying that these type of interventions are never suitable, but particularly when we're dealing with children who themselves have not even experienced puberty and had an opportunity to become comfortable with their sexual bodily selves, we need to be very cautious.
Okay, thank you. And finally, are we at risk of erasing young lesbians from the younger generation?
Well, that's certainly how a lot in the gay community are feeling. And, if we go back to a point that was touched upon earlier on, which is that studies again have shown, and huge anecdotal evidence, that there's a lot of internalized homophobia that takes place. And that's, again, anecdotally, that there are parents out there who would rather and feel it's more societally acceptable for their children to be born in the wrong body than being gay. If those individuals are being encouraged down a path of transitioning, then yes, this might well happen. And we could be erasing individuals who actually are simply gay. And the fact that the gay community themselves are so concerned about this should give us pause for thought.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody. We're going to have a short break now until 12 o'clock. But if you'd like to add extra questions into the Q&A, please do so, and we will consider them in this time. Obviously, we don't want to rule out any questions, but we don't want too many duplicates. Okay, thank you very much, and we will see you all at 12 o'clock. Great, welcome back, everybody. In this part of the webinar, we will be taking questions for the panel. Okay. Firstly, a question for you, James Caspian, that I didn't see when you were giving your presentation. The question is, why did you not find a way to intervene in the MOU formulation at the time they were adding gender identity? What happened to your voice?
Well, I tried persistently for almost 2 years, between 18 months and 2 years, to make my points. And to that end, I spoke and wrote to all the board members of UKCP. I spoke to people that sat on the committee that was creating the MOU. And basically, I was ignored.
Right.
Now, there were one or two smaller points they did take on. I mean, for instance, in the early days of the MOU, it said that one should not make a judgment when making an assessment. And I pointed out that it would be impossible to make an assessment for suitability for treatment without making a judgment. That was actually changed. As far as I can remember, that was about the only thing I ever said that was included in the MOU. My larger points about the conflict between the numbers of detransitioners coming forward, and particularly those saying that they had not had adequate counselling or therapy, or not been able to look at their mental health issues. They'd simply been sort of fast-tracked and affirmed into treatment. Those points were ignored. And I also know that in the committee, I think it was very difficult for anybody who held any other point of view to be heard.
Right, I see. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, a question for Stella specifically, I think. This is as relating to Ireland. In the MOU2 bill we're discussing today, currently in review in Seanad and specific to Ireland, I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce it. Is it? Okay. Does a decision on this bill in Ireland have wider consequences for other jurisdictions? Maybe that's a question for James Esses as well. What's your thoughts, Stella?
Yeah, all around the world, a very similar bill is being proposed in different countries. And so, weirdly enough, I found myself speaking on behalf of GenSpect for the New Zealand parents in GenSpect, and their proposed conversion bill is identical to the Irish one. So there's a similar bill that's kind of doing the round around the countries. And so it does seem to kind of bring in there's a lot of similarities with the MOU2 in the UK and the proposed anti-conversion therapy bill in Ireland. It's still in the Seanad stage, which means it still has a lot of kind of different drafts to go through before it will go through. And I just hope that when it does go through, that it's a progressive and well-worded document, because that's all I think anybody here is seeking.
Any other comments on this question?
Yes, I'd echo what Stella's said just now. And actually, when we've interrogated the wording of these various bills and acts across the world, the wording very much seems to have been copied and pasted, which would from one another, which would lead me to question, well, are thorough consultations taking place? And I'm very thankful that the government in this country have said that they will allow for a thorough consultation. And actually, if we go back to the response that they gave us to our petition, they emphasised that they would be protecting the well-being of children, but also the independence of clinicians. But I think we certainly have reservations given the wording that's used in legislation elsewhere. The problem is the wording itself can be so vague and ambiguous, not dissimilar to the MOU in many ways, that it puts the fear of God into therapists, that by simply carrying out their ethical duties, by simply trying to have an open, explorative conversation with their clients, they could be accused of carrying out conversion therapy and criminalised for it. So the wording is absolutely crucial, and I think this consultation period will be absolutely fundamental to make sure that we don't make the same mistakes that other countries have.
Okay, thank you. A question here. I believe there may be scope within MOU2 to explore gender identity with clients if they bring it in. However, does it allow a therapist to bring the issue into the room if the client is already confident, i.e. affirmed from other places, in their trans or non-binary gender identity? What's the status of bringing something into the room? Any thoughts?
My thoughts, for what it's worth, is that is exactly the sort of area which is just not clear at the moment. And what I could envisage is that a therapist, for perfectly ethical reasons, perhaps wants to address the possibility that a childhood trauma hasn't been properly worked through, and that this might be a factor in a person's trans identification. If the person then goes away and gets a lot of affirmation from perhaps an online community or trans support groups, which says, look, this therapist is being transphobic because they're trying to eradicate your trans identity and put it down to trauma that you're carrying in your body. And if that patient then, as a result, breaks off the therapy, there could be grounds for a complaint. And that would have to be worked out through the particular registering body that therapist belonged to. So it's quite plausible as a member of the UKCP, if that happened to me, the patient would apply to the UKCP, say I'd been practicing conversion therapy, and then I'd be up before the hearing panel having to defend myself and trying to say, whether I had or hadn't practiced conversion therapy, and it would be the patient's word against mine, and there would be a panel trying to decide who was telling the truth or not. And there's no guarantee that I would be found innocent of that. In fact, quite likely, and perhaps quite rightly, hearing panels tend to side with the patient because our regulatory bodies are there primarily to protect the public, not the therapist. Kind of regulatory bodies, not bodies which, as we've seen with James Esses' case, they don't support the therapist. They tend to protect the reputation of the profession in the mind of the public. So I think that's already weighted against the therapist. If such a complaint was brought, it would be quite likely to be upheld. And that's exactly why we're questioning this wording, because it means that perfectly competent therapists are unlikely to want to work with such clients, which means that they're much more likely then to get into the hands of an affirmative therapist, which then, as we've seen, is much more likely to result in medical transition and subsequent possible regret, loss of sexual function, loss of fertility, etc., because these treatments, of course, they have long-term side effects. You can't take very powerful cross-sex hormones without seriously risking damaging your body in all sorts of ways, which I won't go into here. But we do know quite a lot of the side effects of these medications, and also the long-term use of them is experimental. So there's a lot of long-term side effects that we don't know yet, but the ones that we do know are pretty alarming. As I say, I won't go into them now, but that's my view about it. It's uncertain territory, and as a result, it puts us all at risk, including mainly the patient.
Okay, thank you. This is a question which kind of relates to social media, which of course is very important in the influencing of children and young people. So what is the current approach to training in the main psychoanalytic and psychotherapy organisations on the sexual development of children and adolescents, childhood trauma, the mind-body relationship as part of child development theory? Does it take into account of how children's subjectivities are being shaped by social media? Do they supply thinking on all kinds of dissociative disorders, such as eating disorder, body dysmorphic disorder, and gender dysphoria? And how do these relate to each other? But maybe a bit of a focus on social media for this one. What are your thoughts?
Look, me again, I don't want to hog it, but I do teach at the Society of Analytical Psychology, and all I can say is that I do my best to teach something about the effect of dissociative disorders, mind-body dissociation, and its relation to these issues. It's always very contentious. Sometimes students complain, and I don't know anything about. I don't know anything about, even at the SAP. I don't know anything about the role of social media. Whether there's somebody else teaching anything about that, I don't know. But I think it's a relatively new subject. So I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of the trainings really don't put much emphasis on that. And it's a much needed area where, of course, there's a danger about, who teaches it? What orientation do you have? Are you coming from an affirmative place with a political agenda as part of the lobby, which quite a lot of the people with influence seem to be doing? Or are you actually putting a gender critical view across, or do you have a balance where you have some people from both sides and the students can make up their own minds? So at the moment, I'm afraid it's probably not very well taught, although teachers like myself are doing our best.
Okay.
I'd like to comment a little bit on that. Yeah, I agree. It's such a new field. The training isn't available. It will be, no doubt, in the future. But I do think a lot of questions need to be asked around the impact of social media on us in general. I think that, if you look at the year 2012, it feels quite pivotal insofar as that was the year that more of us had smartphones than had dumb phones. It was also the year that kind of the escalation of the kind of social media kind of concept started to accelerate. And at the same time, when you look at the for example, if you look at the issue of children presenting with gender issues, you can see that from 2012 onwards, it started to escalate. So it does feel like something has been happening for the last 10 years that has been impacted by social media. And we don't know, you can't have any kind of conclusion on it, but it is interesting to ask the questions and to look at the graphs and to see the kind of similarities in the escalation of numbers and to explore them in a way that we could kind of progress our thoughts on it.
Okay, thank you. And a slightly related question: how much importance is actually given to the increasingly earlier and earlier pornography use?
Well, yeah, I'll continue, and maybe somebody will come in now after me. Yeah, pornography has definitely become a bigger issue, and it's to do with the fact that there's a smartphone in the pocket of an awful lot of young children, and they're swapping porn with each other, and it is earlier and earlier, and it's also very disturbing. It's very different to what would have been, the average 12-year-old boy in 1990 versus today. It's a very, very different place, and it's very different content that they're accessing. And we need to be very aware of the impact of pornography on young people, and just to see how much it disturbs them. And it's definitely not just boys, it's girls as well. And I'm seeing it in a real issue with clients, is the impact of porn on young people.
Anyone else want to make a comment about that? Okay. This is a question about gender identity. The panelists are using the term gender identity and are doing so uncritically. From a feminist perspective, gender refers to culturally imposed sex role stereotypes. What evidence is there for this alternative definition of gender being some sort of inner essence? Anyone's thoughts on that?
Can I come in on that?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, there's an awful lot in that question. It's a very good question, because I've always been aware that as we talk about these issues, that even when I worked clinically for many years, that there was never any real discussion amongst clinicians and professionals as to what did we really mean by, for instance, transgender, transsexual. What did these words mean? Nobody had really decided, because there was never any authoritative body of knowledge which would be based on peer-reviewed research. There was never anything really that decided that, and in any case, it would only be a matter of opinion. And so, of course, the question is quite right to bring up the question about gender roles, because in the end, it is a lot of what we talk about to do with gender roles, to do with people being uncomfortable with them. I remember seeing a number of people in the later years of my work who initially would say they were genderqueer, and then as the years went by, that changed to non-binary. It seemed to me that it was the same kind of thing. And I would ask people, what do you mean by that? But the interesting thing was, no one could ever really explain it. Not one person. And in the end, I would say something like, well, it sounds as if what you're saying is that you're very uncomfortable with the gender role that goes with your sex, and you don't relate to it, you don't like it, you don't want it. And they would say, yes, that's it. Okay, so we're talking about gender role. Now, there was always some thought that perhaps there was a neurobiological element to gender identity, if you like, gender role adherence, I suppose. And in fact, the Gender Identity Research and Education Society, GIRES, which was a majorly influential organization, also giving training, would teach that gender was in the brain, and they would seek out research papers showing that there were neurobiological elements to gender identity. Now, all of that seems to have faded away, really. It doesn't seem to be fashionable. And nobody ever proved that. For every study somebody could bring up, there was something in the brain, then someone would bring another study, and neurologists would say no. And, it's completely up for discussion. It's not decided, and there isn't really any evidence of it. So, of course, the feminist point of view is that it's all about the gender roles. Gender roles are assigned, not sex at birth, absolutely. sex is a physical characteristics. A gender role is arguably assigned. And we can be discussing that forever about where does that come from, and people have different points of view. So sorry, I hope I haven't lost the question, but yeah, I hope I'm addressing your point. That there is no consensus on this, and so when people say transgender of trans people, what do they mean? I think we always knew that people came to request treatment from a gender clinic for lots of different reasons, and some researchers had written about theories about typologies. Again, it's a very new field. There's no solid body of knowledge on it. But I also think that these are the kinds of discussions that need to be had, because this is what underpins everything that we're talking about. What is trans? What is that? I can't tell you. Probably you can't tell me. When I ask people, what do you mean by that? They have trouble in saying what that is, because it's not one thing. In the old days, we used to talk about transsexuals, cross-dressers, and so on. That's completely out of fashion. Now, I think people who we would have called cross-dressers come under trans, and they might decide they identify as women, and so, or vice versa. So, it's a kind of a cultural phenomenon, which you've got sociological view, you've got medical views, philosophical views. It's huge, and it's in its infancy, and nothing is decided, I would say.
Okay, thank you. Bob?
Can I just add from the psychotherapeutic point of view that sometimes what somebody calls their gender identity is something that they use to hold themselves together. It feels really important, and that's why some people being misgendered can be so painful, because it kind of can cause a collapse in a sense of identity. But if I can broaden the question and think about where do other disembodied identities come from, or where do other identities which are at odds with the body come from, that's where I find the work of Winnicott very helpful in his look at mind-body dissociation. And sometimes it can be sort of saving that person's integrity to get away from something unbearable which is associated with the body. And that is part of, I think, the build-up of the disembodied identity in general, which we're quite prone to in our culture, because, look, we're disembodied now, more or less. We've got a visual contact, but we spend a lot of time disembodied. And a lot of our identities are made up through these sort of disembodied identifications. Actually, it's such a huge subject, and the whole notion of identification and where does it come from, these are really important issues. But I'm just sorry, I don't want to go on too long, but I know there's a feminist critique as well, which would say the whole notion of gender identity is just made up, and it's cultural stereotypes, and really what is real is the body. And I can quite see that as a perspective, because the body is real. However, as a psychotherapist working with the mind, I do regard that as equally real, but in a different way, and very, very important. So for myself, psychotherapeutically, I think this notion of a gender identity can be important for particular people, although it can be used, as I'm saying, defensively, as a way from getting away from painful feelings which are trapped in the body to do with trauma and so on. But Winnicott's the person who I think is good there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Let's have a look. Okay. This is a question about sexual orientation and gender identity. The questioner says, there seems to be some agreement that sexual orientation and gender identity are different, and much of the conflict seems to come from addressing them both in the same MOU. What are the panel's views of producing two separate MOUs?
I think it's an interesting idea. I'm not sure if it would work. I would like to see it done out, and I'd like to see how it would play out. It makes sense to me intuitively, because they're two different concepts, so they need two different analyses. Yeah, and I think it would clarify an awful lot. And I think more than anything, like this conference is, we need to talk about the MOU too. I think the point is that we need clarification, that there's too much obfuscation, there's too much kind of open to interpretation. I can see a lot of people who are pro the affirmative, for example, in the chat, keep on saying, but yeah, no, exploratory therapy is perfectly fine. And I'm like, well, A, I'm delighted to hear it. B, I wish we didn't feel that it wasn't fine. And so there has been some sort of miscommunication, because if some people believe that exploratory therapy isn't appropriate within the MOU2 document, well, then on some level, either we're reading it wrong or they're reading it wrong. And so we need some further clarification. And that's where I think just definitely more attention to the words and more clarity would really help us all with this memorandum. But yeah, I personally like the idea of two documents, but I haven't seen many other people agree with me.
I also think it's a mistake to conflate gender identity with biological sex, and also sexual orientation with gender identity. You don't need any medical treatment ever to be gay, but it puts it in a different kind of context. If you think that it's ever appropriate to have medical treatment, then I think that's a very different ballpark, really. So that's what I think. Yeah, I think they're separate, and they should be separated.
Could I just make a point? Because I saw a quote there from the memorandum, which kind of could suggest that maybe exploratory therapy could be upheld or supported or protected. I suppose my issue is that so many therapists don't think it's protected. So many therapists think that they will be open to accusations of misinformed accusations of a conversion therapy. So many therapists believe that all they can do is affirm, and that's their only option. And because of that, I would argue that I know very many therapists who are brilliant, who I'd love to recommend, but who will not work with gender-related distress because they believe it's a very constrained field, because they believe that the document doesn't give them enough room to maneuver. So although some therapists here are saying it, I presume some of these people in the chat are therapists, some people are saying, oh no, it's in the memorandum, it's fine. If many therapists are saying, we don't feel free to explore, and so we're staying away from gender, well then there's a problem with the document, and it needs a bit more clarity.
I would like to also just come in there and reiterate what I said at the beginning, which was that the MOU isn't clear, because it does also say that exploratory therapy may be all right with people who are uncertain about their gender identity. Therefore, it can be read to mean that if they are certain, it is not. And then remember that the BACP journal also published a letter saying that the MOU is steering in the direction of saying affirmation is non-negotiable. That was read by thousands and thousands of BACP members. So I think I rest my case. I think the MOU is very unclear. And those two illustrations show why. I think there are probably others.
And could I add just something what James just rose there? Certainty is a very interesting psychological concept. Just because somebody is certain doesn't mean that everybody around them should be certain. And just because somebody believes they're certain doesn't mean that there isn't room for exploration. And so for certain to be a kind of almost a diktat within the memorandum makes me think whoever wrote that sentence might not have enough psychological insight to pause at the word certainty and say that in itself, because the human condition is not certain. The human condition, our natural condition, is a quite uncertain person. We don't know where we've come from, we don't know where we're going, and most of us feel uncertain. And so certainty shouldn't be a kind of a category of whether we can proceed with exploration or not. It feels incredibly inappropriate.
If I could just come in there briefly and just touching upon this idea of certainty and affirmation. Gender dysphoria is still, as far as I'm aware, I'm happy to be corrected by anyone in the audience, still as far as I'm aware, the only mental health condition in which the proposed treatment is to affirm the thoughts inside someone's own head which are causing them distress and anxiety. I mean, if we take something like body dysmorphia, for example, a client can come through and be convinced that they are ugly, that they are obese, that they must have surgery to change how they look physically. If a therapist were to kind of blindly affirm that person's thoughts and feelings towards themselves, that would be deeply unethical. But I'm not sure why we do it in this space. And obviously, there's a lot of comments being made about the fact that the MOU wording doesn't prohibit affirmation, but then we're also, doesn't solely expect affirmation. But we're hearing, including from our panelists, that their interpretation is that it does. So there is confusion and a lack of consistency in the space. I mean, if we look at what happened to me, the wording of my petition and the associated publicity at the time was only ever calling for clarification around exploration. And I've been effectively expelled from the profession. So I'm not sure how people can say that it doesn't only ask for affirmation. And we're also hearing from detransitioners, including in this country, saying that the therapist that they went to see at the time blindly encouraged and affirmed them down a medical pathway. And now they're regretting this deeply. So if there are therapists out there who feels it tells them to affirm, and if there are detransitioners who have been at the receiving end of that affirmation, we clearly have a problem here. This is why we need to have a discussion, an open, respectful dialogue.
Can I also say that I think one day we're going to look back on all this and think, how the hell did it happen? You know, how did all these kids with mental health issues, some of whom were autistic, traumatized, sexually abused, internally homophobic, how did we end up affirming them down this route to medical treatment that actually in the long run harms them? And I'm not saying that some people don't benefit from it. Obviously, lots of people do, even though, you know, it's just anecdotal, it's their own subjective experience. But I do think these people who are harmed, they'll want an explanation. How did it happen? How did we get in this position? And I think one of the answers is, well, we've had this bloody memorandum of understanding, and whether or not it really meant this, it's been interpreted to mean that exploratory therapy is dangerous because you could be struck off for doing it. So we've left these kids in the lurch. And the memorandum will be one of the reasons, looking back, that will give an explanation for how it's happened. And I think the WPATH guidelines from 2012 are another explanation. And I think we need to do something now. It's our responsibility as therapists to try and get these things right, to do a better job so that we minimize the harm going forward.
Great, thank you. And just to pick up on the point you made, James, about debate and respectful debate, there's a comment here which refers to the spat in the chat room earlier in the webinar. This is the comment. James made a comment about not hearing back from any of the counter-signatories to the MOU2, but I'm also aware that one of the CEOs of one of the counter-signatories was ejected from this meeting. The question is, how are you reconciling asking for dialogue but refusing to engage with it when it is in front of you? And I think this is an important point about how we talk to each other. Any thoughts?
I'm disappointed anybody was ejected from this discussion, because I do want to speak to everybody who has issues. I'd be delighted, and I'm sure other therapists among my colleagues would be happy to speak to anybody afterwards if they proposed a discussion. Wouldn't it be amazing if we could build a bridge, and if actually therapists that don't agree with us emailed us and said, yeah, I'd like a discussion, and we actually have a discussion, that we actually kind of try to find some ground on which we can kind of produce some kind of productive speech. If somebody was ejected, I gather they were, like, I can imagine if I was moderating a meeting, one is nervous these days because everything feels very heightened. And I can see how this could have happened, and it could have happened by mistake. It could have happened on purpose. I don't know. But I would strongly think that I'd love to discuss it further with anybody who's willing to.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think it was somebody who made a personal attack on me and got expelled for that. I appreciate people trying to protect me from that, but like Stella, I'm happy to talk to anybody, but there's a limit about respect, isn't there? We do want to respect other people, and we want to be respected by them. So somebody made a judgment call. It may be right, it may be wrong, I don't know, but I can appreciate both sides.
Okay, thank you. Let's just have a look. Okay, this is a question about desistance. Okay, all 12 published studies of desistance persistence, which found that around 80% of children desist, were carried out under a watchful waiting approach, which of course included some exploration family therapy. Do the therapeutic bodies such as UKCP retrospectively judge this to be conversion therapy? If not, can they point to what was wrong with this approach and why it's been replaced with affirmation?
So that's a great question, and we can't answer that. It's a great question.
Well, when I went to the board of UKCP in 2015, and it was discovered that I specialised in working with people who were transitioning gender, a sigh of relief went round, because I don't think there was anybody there that knew anything about it. Since then, of course, things may have changed.
Okay.
I'm just going to put one in the chat that seems to have gone just to me rather than to everybody, if you follow me. So I'm just going to put it in if I can. I don't seem to be able to. I'll put it in the chat, a question, if you follow me.
I've got one for you, Stella.
Oh, yeah, it's okay. Yeah, go ahead. Something about Iggy Moon. It just seems to be directed to me. I don't know.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, go.
No, this was a question for you. Can we have clarity on the various meanings of affirmation therapy and the issue of there not being a singular meaning? I feel affirmative care is being misrepresented in the comments.
Okay. Well, I would love to have more clarity, but I do know that the affirmative approach suggests that we affirm a person's identity in whatever way they describe it, and at whatever age. And I do know, people like Dr. Diane de Ehrensaft, who's considered a leading light in the affirmative approach. She has talked about, toddlers who are 18 months old making gendered communication by opening their onesie and creating a dress. And certainly she has talked about gendered communication of, infants or children who are 3 and 4, because they, might pull their clips out of their hair and things like that. So what's interesting about the gender, affirmative approach is that we basically affirm whatever the client in front of us says about their gender identity. And as James Esses kind of raised, do we do that in any other context? Because I certainly don't. And I'm very affirming as a person, but that doesn't mean I would affirm every passing thought or belief about their gender identity or about anything else. I think exploration is a more respectful gift to offer in terms of therapy.
Now,
so I put that question in the chat, the one that I thought was interesting. I don't know why it went somewhere else. It's a long question. It's been sent to me, I think, or something.
Okay.
I don't know.
There's a number of questions about training, so forgive me if I don't read all of them out, but broadly speaking, this is one of them anyway. What do the panel think about people like Dr. Moon calling for therapists to have special training in gender and sexuality in order to practice with these clients? And the questioner says, doesn't this make a huge assumption that therapists live in a vacuum and don't know about gender and sexuality? Don't they realise that most of us are LGBT ourselves or have LGBT children, brothers and sisters, close friends, so we know a great deal about the suffering of sexual minorities. So what, panel, is your view of the need for so-called specialist training?
From my own perspective, I don't have any issue with training in this field, but we have to accept two certainties, which are, firstly, this is a very complicated issue and very sensitive. And as we've even seen from conversations today, there is not a decisive judgment on the best treatment pathways for gender dysphoria. So it's very complicated. The second thing we need to accept is that training institutions, universities, etc., are places for debate and for open dialogue when trying to muddle our way through what are complex issues, and particularly in the psychotherapeutic profession. Our entire profession is based on having conversations, listening to other people, seeing what we can learn from other people. Any training that acknowledges both those points, I would have absolutely no problem with. But what I've encountered firsthand and anecdotally from other training institutions in this country is that practitioners and trainees are being taught a model and preached to, and it's basically along the lines of an ideology. And if they do not accept it, then whatever views they have are as good as ignored. And that is not in the interest of our clients when we're talking about a complex mental health condition.
I used to give training in transgender awareness to the public and private sector and to psychotherapists. That training changed over the years as I realized that the field was changing. And by the end of the time that I was doing that, up till about 2 or 3 years ago, I think, I would explain to the people that came to the training pretty much everything that was going on in the field, including all of the political complexities. And I was contacted by a social services department of a northern county that wanted me to come back and do more trainings for their social services. And I explained I wasn't doing the trainings at the moment. And the person who wanted to engage me said, but the only other trainings we can find are coming from a particular kind of political perspective, as James is suggesting, a particular kind of ideology, which no doubt the people giving it believe are absolutely right, but it's only one point of view. And so, again, this feeling that it's very difficult to introduce any alternative points of view to that, what's become known as the trans narrative, really. And very few people gave trainings, very few indeed. And most of the people giving trainings, at least initially, were coming from a campaigning background. So they weren't working in clinics with people going forward into treatment. They were coming from a particular point of view that they were campaigning for. So arguably those trainings are biased. And who decides what goes in the training? Well, just the person that is giving it. They put in what they want to put in. Again, there's no really solid body of knowledge there. It's a very new field. So I think the whole discussion about trainings is difficult because it all comes down to who is giving the training and what are they putting in it and where are they coming from. So, there's no definitive answer to that. Should therapists have training? Well, I think that point is right, that most therapists do live in the real world and inform themselves about a variety of issues, and that might be personal experience as well. And so a good therapist really can work with any issue because you work with the person in front of you. You don't work with a label. You're working with a human being, and you're working with the psyche. And if, as Bob does and as I do, work with the knowledge that the unconscious is present in the room with you and the client as well, that's where you work from. And so the idea that you're ignorant unless you've done a special training, and you have to do a training that's given by a particular organization with a particular perspective to educate you because you just don't know, I think that's quite a dangerous idea.
Okay.
Yeah, well said, James. I agree.
Thank you. A few questions relating to the MOU. This is a two-part question. Given what James Esses related about the seemingly unanswerable nature of the group who produced the MOU, could you elaborate a bit on exactly how the document has formal authority? For example, could it be brought up in court? And secondly, possibly a related question, could you give an overview of the landscape of professional bodies with the power to discipline or strike off therapists in the UK? What, if any, hierarchy exists between the various bodies and who is answerable to which body? And then just a comment, huge thanks to all participants.
I can certainly come in on the first part. I mean, this is what we spent a lot of time trying to figure out exactly. What is this coalition? How are they formed? Are they legally formed, for example? I mean, it seems that we're at the point, actually, where the coalition is not a formal entity per se. It's more the collective of these individual signatory organisations. The problem is that when we as a collective and other therapists have gone with concerns to their individual organisations, there does not seem to be any formal method in which we can actually relay those concerns. And they seem to be either just dismissed or plainly ignored. So we wouldn't seem to have any kind of legal route in terms of the coalition as a whole. It would seem to be needing to engage with each individual signatory on its own merit. Again, this is part of the reason we're having this webinar, because unless therapists who have concerns are raising these en masse with the regulatory bodies, nothing's going to change. And obviously we want to avoid litigation if we can at all costs. We should be able to resolve these things as mature adults with one another. It shouldn't take taking our governing bodies to court.
Indeed. Would somebody like to comment on the professional bodies? This is always quite controversial in that we pay our subscriptions to these governing bodies, but they see themselves primarily as not supporting us the way that happens with the medical profession, but rather protecting the public. So the question is, could you give an overview of the landscape of professional bodies with the power to discipline or strike off therapists in the UK? What, if any, hierarchy exists between the various bodies and who's answerable to which body?
I'll come in on that one. First of all, psychotherapy and counselling are not statutorily regulated professions in the UK, so you don't have to be a member of a professional body in order to practice. You don't even need to be a member in order to get insurance. You simply need to have had a recognised training in order to get insurance to practice. In practice, many people join the professional bodies, and of course there are many. The best known would be BACP and UKCP, but there are many other smaller regulatory bodies, such as the NRHP, the National Register of Hypnotherapists and Psychotherapists, or the Association of Christian Counsellors, and there's quite a lot of others. There's quite a long list. Not all of these have signed up to the MOU, but many of them have. So I don't believe there's a hierarchy per se, but some bodies are more well known than others. So, for instance, if you want to get a job, if you're a counsellor or a therapist and you actually want a job employed by a local authority or health authority, then you would probably need to be a member of BACP or UKCP at the very least. It used to be the case that it was BACP, and that was partly because BACP had been a lot better at making employers aware of their existence. It wasn't that they were a more senior regulatory body or anything like that, although they're pretty big. They've got the most number of members, I think, but that they simply made those connections. So, such and such health authority wants a counsellor, right, we want them to be registered with BACP. That was up to the health authority to decide that. UKCP was trying to make more inroads into that, because UKCP, which only had about 8,000 members signed up when I was a member, maybe more now, I don't know, they were trying to get themselves better known amongst employers. And then there are all the smaller ones. So the answer is there is no hierarchy. Some are simply better known than others. They have more money than others. They have millions of pounds of annual income, the large ones, which then employ staff and have offices and CEOs and so on and so forth. And then they have more clout, because then they will make more connections with government and try and influence government policy, and they can sit around the table, they employ people, so they can send people out to do work. Whereas the smaller ones might be simply run by volunteers who simply don't have the resources or the time to do that kind of work. So I hope that answers your question. Perhaps one other part of the question was that about how much censure they have over the members. Well, of course they have the power to, if somebody makes a complaint to them about a member, to then investigate, and if they decide so, to remove somebody from the register which they've paid money to be on. But nobody actually has to be on those registers because it's not statutorily regulated.
Okay, thank you. A question here about research. Thanks for this important discussion. Can I please ask about whether there are any peer-reviewed studies into the current cohort of gender-questioning young people and the potential impact of social media and porn? I'm also interested in the overrepresentation of those with ASD from the GIDS stats.
I'm not aware of any such research going on at the moment, but that doesn't mean there isn't. We often only hear about research when the university or body concerned is actually publishing it. But we might hear about it because you know there's a call for participation. I heard that somebody at Bath University was researching detransitioners or researching outcomes because there was a call for participants, but that research hasn't come out yet. So, to my knowledge, there isn't, but that doesn't mean that there isn't.
Okay.
You could ask a question of SEGM, maybe. You could send an email to them. That's what does it stand for?
Society for Evidence-Based Gender Medicine.
Thank you, Stella. They've got a very good bibliography, and they keep very well abreast of the latest publications. And
we do know, though, that autism is overrepresented among gender dysphoric young people. I know one GIDS analysis said that 48% of children presenting at GIDS, which is the largest UK gender clinic for the NHS, 48% are presented with mild to severe autistic traits. And so that's just close on 1 and 2. And so it's definitely something that needs an awful lot more, analysis and attention. Like, why is this? There should be a conference on specifically the overlap between gender dysphoria and autism spectrum disorder and see what information comes out.
Okay, thank you. We've got about 10 minutes left. I'm just going to look at a couple of forward-looking questions. This one is, I'm about to embark on a master's programme in child psychotherapy accredited by UKCP. What practical advice can you give to someone like me who shares your concerns about setting children on a medical pathway?
Just speaking from my own experience, I mean, ultimately, you have to do what is right for you. I'm aware of other trainee therapists who have reached out to me in particular, since my case has gone public, who share these thoughts and feelings, but they're too scared to voice them. And I think part of the problem is, given how vulnerable particularly trainees are, it would seem now, to simply being expelled from courses. If everyone voices their concerns and everyone gets expelled, then there's no therapist left to actually do the ethical practices that we're hoping can occur. So just, I would say you have to do what's right for you. I think some people are of the view that they just kind of keep their head down and get through the training, so they can get the accreditation. But then, as we've heard, even once you've got the accreditation, you're still vulnerable to being hauled in front of various, conduct panels with the regulatory bodies. So there are, as you can see today, Thoughtful Therapists Collective, and there's many others too, groups of therapists who share these concerns in which we can discuss these things, openly and respectfully. But in terms of whether or not you want to raise your concerns with your course, that has to be a matter for you and how comfortable you feel with doing so. But I hope as time goes on, more and more people will feel comfortable to do so, particularly in light of Maya Forsas's judgment, because we have to remember that these beliefs are protected under law.
Okay, thank you. And a related question, could the panel offer some suggestions for what we can do, please?
I would like to answer to that. Suggestions, what we could do is, if you don't feel comfortable speaking out, and if you do feel comfortable, please do speak out. But if you don't, please write letters. Please kind of use your pen as such and kind of write letters to various places, whether it's newspapers or to the accreditation bodies or to various different organizations that are set up because I think an awful lot of people feel unsure and uneasy about the integrity of therapy at the moment. I'm dismayed at how many people feel that they didn't receive good therapy. And I think we are part of a movement that is seeking to kind of improve the quality of the therapy that's been offered, not only for people who have gender-related distress, but just in general, the kind of the integrity and the ethics surrounding organisations that seem to be unhappy to be questioned. That these are big issues, and I think, if anything, we need to kind of encourage people to speak up, either speak up or write in.
If you're part of the UKCP, there's an election going on now for the new chair. Find out what the candidates' views are on this subject. And another thing is that there's going to be this government consultation coming up soon. And there's going to be a ban to make conversion therapy illegal. And if that becomes a law, then it becomes even worse, because if it's not clear what's illegal, then not only are we going to be struck off, we might be even sent to prison. If it goes the same way as in Australia, in Melbourne, I think it's a maximum sentence of 10 years in prison, is it, for practicing conversion therapy? So you could write to your MPs to ask that whatever form this conversion therapy bill takes, it protects exploratory therapy, and it's very clear about what is and isn't allowed. And personally, I'm not in favour of any legal ban on anything, because I consider that my therapy should give me enough training to know how to work. And in the long run, what I'd hope is that other therapists felt confident to work within their competency, and didn't be frightened about working with these particular types of patients. So there's a few things that people can do. Also, I think Mel's going to say this in a minute, but this costs thoughtful therapists some money to put on. So if anybody felt like making a donation to thoughtful therapists to cover the costs after this webinar, that would be very gratefully received and help us to keep on doing our work. And you could join thoughtful therapists if you wanted to.
You could donate to Jane's Esses crowdfunding. Many ways you can help. Could I just say something that that Bob kind of lifted there, that what we need very well worded kind of definitions of, as James Caspian said, what is trans, what is gender identity, what is conversion therapy, and these definitions need to be much more clearer, and then we will all be able to feel more secure in what is and what isn't. Because if affirmative therapists are on the chat saying, oh no, exploratory therapy is fine, and if we're saying it's not, well, then we need clarity. It's quite clear from this conference, if nothing else, that there is a lack of clarity that is making us disagree on points where some people are saying it's there and some people are saying it's not. Well, that means we need more clarity.
I mean, the sorts of questions that come up are, for instance, if you start talking to a patient about detransitioners, does that constitute conversion therapy? Some patients might feel it did. If you accidentally misgender somebody, and maybe you do it a few times, does that constitute an attempt at conversion therapy? It shouldn't, but it could. It could be interpreted that kind of way, and things need clarification, I think. Either they need clarification or they need putting back in the therapeutic domain and not put into the legal domain, which is a worrying development in our culture. Everything seems to be becoming so litigious at the moment. It's not something personally I'm in favour of. Anyway.
Okay. Right. We're running out of time, and I think as it's a very important, this has been a very important debate. I'd really like to thank all members of the panel and indeed the participants for a very interesting and stimulating morning. As Bob said, if you're interested, would like to join or to donate even to Thoughtful Therapists, please see details from the webpage, which is www.thoughtfultherapist.org. There's a great deal of information there. Once again, thank you very much all for participating, and I hope you have an enjoyable weekend.